In the grand halls of Buckingham Palace, where centuries of royal tradition echo through marble corridors, King Charles III sat alone in his private study at 3 a.m., holding a letter that would force him to make the most difficult decision of his reign. The parchment trembled slightly in his weathered hands as he read the words again, each sentence carrying the weight of a revelation that could shake the very foundation of the British monarchy. This wasn't about politics, scandals, or state affairs. This was personal. This was about a secret that had been buried for over 30 years, a secret that involved a choice no king had ever faced before. As dawn approached, Charles knew that within hours he would have to do something unprecedented, something that would either save his family or destroy the crown forever. What he discovered that night would lead to a decision so shocking that even his closest advisors would question his sanity. But sometimes being a true king means choosing love over legacy, heart over heritage, and humanity over the heavy burden of a crown. The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Buckingham Palace as King Charles III walked slowly through the corridors that had witnessed centuries of royal drama. His footsteps echoed against the polished marble floors, each step heavy with the weight of the decision he had made just hours before. The letter that had arrived mysteriously on his desk the previous evening had changed everything he thought he knew about his family's history. Sarah Mitchell had been his personal secretary for over 15 years, and she had never seen the king look so troubled. When she entered his private office that Tuesday morning, she found him standing by the tall windows, gazing out at the bustling streets of London below. The usual morning briefings and state papers lay untouched on his mahogany desk, replaced by a single envelope bearing no official seal or return address. "Your Majesty," Sarah said softly, her voice careful and measured. "The Prime Minister's office called. They're expecting your response to the Commonwealth meeting proposal by noon." Charles turned slowly, his face showing the exhaustion of a man who had not slept. "Sarah, in all your years serving the crown, have you ever encountered a situation where duty and family seem to pull in completely opposite directions?" The question caught her off guard. Throughout their professional relationship, the king had always maintained a clear boundary between his personal struggles and his royal obligations. This moment of vulnerability was unprecedented, and Sarah could sense the gravity of whatever was weighing on his mind. "I believe, Your Majesty, that the greatest leaders are those who find a way to honor both when the path seems impossible," she replied carefully. Charles nodded slowly and returned to his desk. The letter lay open before him, its contents having been read and reread countless times throughout the sleepless night. The handwriting was elegant, but shaky, clearly written by someone advanced in years. The return address showed a small cottage in the Scottish Highlands, a place that held memories Charles had buried deep in his heart decades ago. A letter was from Margaret Sinclair, a woman he had known during his young adult years, long before his marriage to Diana. Margaret had been different from the carefully selected companions typically arranged for royal courtship. She was a teacher from a middle-class family, passionate about literature, and completely unimpressed by titles or wealth. Their relationship had been brief but profound, ending abruptly when royal duties and expectations forced them apart. What the letter revealed, however, was something that no amount of royal protocol had prepared him for. Margaret was dying, and she had a daughter who was 32 years old, the same age that would make her Charles's child from their brief relationship 3 decades ago. The daughter, named Eleanor, had grown up believing her father was Margaret's deceased husband, a story Margaret had maintained to protect both the royal family and her child from scandal. But now, as Margaret faced her final months, she wanted Eleanor to know the truth. More than that, she wanted to meet her father, even if just once. The letter explained that Eleanor had no idea about her true parentage and that Margaret had spent years debating whether this secret should die with her. The decision to reach out to Charles came only after her doctors confirmed that her cancer was terminal and that she had perhaps 6 months to live. Charles set the letter down and walked to the portrait gallery that lined one wall of his office. Generations of monarchs looked down at him from their gilded frames, each face representing the weight of duty and sacrifice that came with the crown. His great-great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, gazed sternly from her portrait, a woman who had understood the complexity of balancing personal happiness with royal responsibility. His own mother, Queen Elizabeth II, smiled from a more recent photograph, her expression conveying the wisdom earned through decades of putting duty before personal desire. The king's mind raced through the implications of what he had learned. If Eleanor truly was his daughter, she had a legitimate claim to her place in the line of succession, even though she had been born outside of marriage. More importantly, she was his child, a person who had lived her entire life without knowing her true father. The thought of a daughter growing up believing herself to be an orphan when she had a father who could have provided for her, loved her, and been part of her life tore at his heart in ways he had not expected. But the complications were enormous. The revelation of an illegitimate daughter would send shockwaves through the monarchy at a time when Charles was still establishing his reign after his mother's death. The media would have a field day with the story, and the political implications could be severe. The Church of England, which Charles headed as monarch, would face difficult questions about moral leadership. The public, already skeptical of the monarchy's relevance in modern times, might view this as another example of royal hypocrisy and privilege. Yet as he stood there, surrounded by the weight of royal history, Charles found himself thinking not about crowns or kingdoms, but about a young woman named Eleanor who might be spending her days not knowing that her father was thinking about her, longing to meet her, and struggling with a decision that could change both their lives forever. His phone buzzed with a text message from his son William, asking about their scheduled lunch meeting. Charles stared at the message, thinking about his relationship with his own children, and how different Eleanor's life might have been if she had grown up with the knowledge of her true parentage. William and Harry had faced their own challenges growing up in the royal spotlight, but they had never questioned their father's love or their place in his life. The morning continued with a series of meetings that Charles attended in body but not in spirit. His mind kept returning to the letter, to Margaret's words about Eleanor's kindness, her intelligence, her work as a pediatric nurse in Edinburgh. Margaret had included a photograph, and Charles had studied it for hours during the night. Eleanor had his eyes, the same green color that had been passed down through generations of the Windsor family. Her smile reminded him of his sister Anne, confident and genuine. She looked like someone he would have been proud to call his daughter. As the day progressed, Charles found himself making small talk with staff members about their families, asking questions he had never thought to ask before. His equerry, James Morrison, mentioned his daughter's recent graduation from university, and Charles found himself asking detailed questions about her studies, her ambitions, her relationship with her father. Each conversation only deepened his sense of what he might have missed with Eleanor. The afternoon brought a meeting with the Archbishop of Canterbury, a regular consultation about church matters that took on new significance in light of the morning's revelation. As they discussed various ecclesiastical issues, Charles found himself studying the Archbishop's face, wondering what advice this spiritual leader would give about his situation. The conversation turned to the Church's evolving position on family structures and the importance of forgiveness and redemption. "Your Majesty," the Archbishop said during a pause in their discussion, "I've always believed that God's greatest gifts come not in the grand gestures, but in the quiet moments when we choose love over fear, truth over convenience." The words seemed to speak directly to Charles's dilemma, though the Archbishop had no knowledge of the letter or its contents. Charles wondered if this was divine guidance or simply the coincidence of wise words spoken at the right moment. By evening, Charles had made his decision. He would meet Eleanor, but he would do it in a way that protected her from the immediate chaos that royal revelation could bring. He would travel to Scotland quietly, perhaps under the pretense of visiting one of his properties there. He would meet Margaret first, hear her full story, and then, if she agreed, he would meet Eleanor as simply a family friend paying respects to a dying woman. The plan was not perfect, and Charles knew that eventually, if Eleanor truly was his daughter, bigger decisions would need to be made about her future and her place in the royal family. But for now, this felt like the right first step. He was choosing to be a father before a king, at least for one weekend in Scotland. As he prepared for bed that night, Charles looked once more at Eleanor's photograph. Tomorrow, he would begin making arrangements for a trip that could change his life and hers forever. For the first time since receiving the letter, he felt a sense of peace about his decision. Some choices, he realized, were too important to be made based on duty alone. Some choices required the courage to follow one's heart, regardless of the consequences. 3 days after receiving Margaret's letter, Charles found himself driving through the winding roads of the Scottish Highlands in an unmarked car, accompanied only by his most trusted protection officer, Detective Inspector David Walsh. The official story was that the king was making a private visit to inspect one of the duchy properties in the area, a perfectly reasonable explanation that raised no suspicions among the palace staff or media. The autumn landscape stretched endlessly before them, painted in brilliant shades of gold and crimson that reminded Charles why Scotland had always held such a special place in his heart. This was where he had first learned to find solace away from the pressures of royal life, where he had discovered his love of nature and environmental conservation. It was also where he had met Margaret, 33 years ago, during a hiking expedition that had changed the course of his young adult life. Margaret's cottage sat nestled in a valley surrounded by ancient oak trees, their branches now bare except for a few stubborn leaves clinging to the onset of winter. Smoke rose gently from the chimney, creating a scene so peaceful and ordinary that Charles almost forgot the extraordinary circumstances that had brought him here. As he approached the front door, his heart pounded with an intensity he had not felt since his coronation. Margaret answered the door herself, despite her obvious frailness. The years had been kind to her in some ways, her silver hair still thick and her green eyes still bright with intelligence, but the cancer had taken its toll, leaving her thin and pale, moving with the careful deliberation of someone managing constant pain. "Charles," she said simply, her voice carrying the same warm Scottish accent he remembered, "thank you for coming." They sat in her small living room, surrounded by bookshelves that reached from floor to ceiling and photographs that chronicled a life well lived. Charles noticed several pictures of Eleanor at various ages, from a gap-toothed 7-year-old to her recent nursing school graduation. In each photo, the resemblance to the Windsor family features became more apparent. Margaret served tea with steady hands, a ritual that seemed to give her strength. "I need you to understand," she began, "that I never intended for this secret to burden you. When I discovered I was pregnant, you were already engaged to Diana. The palace had made it clear that our relationship was temporary, a brief interlude before you assumed your proper royal responsibilities." Charles set down his teacup, his hands trembling slightly. "Margaret, if I had known, if anyone had told me, things might have been different. I would have found a way to be part of her life, to support both of you." "I know you would have tried," Margaret replied gently, "but we both know the constraints you faced then, just as you face them now. I made the choice to protect Eleanor from the complications of royal life, to let her grow up as a normal child with a normal life. And she has had a wonderful life, Charles. She's become everything I could have hoped for in a daughter." Over the next hour, Margaret shared stories of Eleanor's childhood and young adulthood. She spoke of Eleanor's natural compassion, which had led her to nursing. She described her daughter's love of hiking and photography, interests that seemed to echo Charles's own passions. Most touchingly, she told him about Eleanor's work with children in the hospital, how she had a gift for making even the most frightened young patients feel safe and cared for. "She's been asking questions about her father more frequently lately," Margaret admitted. "I think part of her has always suspected that the story I told her wasn't complete. She looks nothing like the man I claimed was her father, and she has mannerisms, interests, and even expressions that I could never explain." Charles studied the photographs more carefully, noticing details he had missed before. Eleanor's posture in several pictures was remarkably similar to his own, and her laugh, captured in candid moments, seemed to echo his sister Anne's infectious joy. The evidence was overwhelming, even without official confirmation. "I want to meet her," Charles said finally. "But I also want to protect her from the chaos that revelation of her parentage would create." "How do we do this, Margaret? How do we give her the truth without destroying the life you've worked so hard to build for her?"
Margaret had been thinking about this question for months.
"Eleanor is coming to visit this weekend. I told her I had an old friend who wanted to meet her, someone who knew her father years ago. She's curious, but not suspicious. If you're comfortable with it, you could meet her as simply Charles, someone from my past who wanted to pay respects to an old friend's family." The plan was both simple and terrifying. Charles would have the chance to meet his daughter, to speak with her, and get to know her as a person, without the immediate pressure of revealing their relationship. It would give him time to understand who she was, and what kind of person she had become. And it would give her time to form her own impression of him before learning the truth that would change everything. That evening, Charles stayed at a small inn in the nearby village, using an assumed name and relying on his protection officer's expertise to maintain his anonymity. He found himself unable to sleep, his mind racing with questions about what he would say to Eleanor, how he would react to meeting her, and what the long-term implications of this encounter might be. He thought about his own relationship with his father, Prince Philip, and the complex dynamics that had shaped their interactions over the years. He considered the challenges that William and Harry had faced growing up in the public eye, and he wondered what Eleanor's life might have been like if she had grown up with the knowledge of her royal heritage. The next morning brought news that made his situation even more complicated. His private secretary called to inform him that a tabloid newspaper had begun investigating rumors about a secret royal visit to Scotland. While they had no specific information about Margaret or Eleanor, their inquiries were getting uncomfortably close to the truth. "We need to accelerate our timeline," Charles told his protection officer. "If the press discovers what's happening here, it will destroy any chance of handling this situation with dignity and privacy." Detective Inspector Walsh, a man who had served the royal family for over 20 years, nodded grimly. "Sir, I've already identified 3 alternate routes back to London, and I've arranged for a decoy convoy to leave from your official property this afternoon. We can buy you perhaps 24 hours before anyone realizes you're not where you're supposed to be." Charles appreciated the loyalty and efficiency of his protection team, but he knew that 24 hours might not be enough time to meet Eleanor, assess the situation, and determine the best path forward. Every minute was precious, and every decision carried enormous weight. He returned to Margaret's cottage that afternoon, finding her preparing for Eleanor's arrival with the careful attention to detail that spoke of a woman who understood the significance of this moment. Fresh flowers adorned the small dining table, and Margaret had prepared Eleanor's favorite meal, a traditional Scottish dish that brought back memories of her childhood. "Are you ready for this?" Margaret asked as they heard a car approaching on the gravel drive. Charles looked out the window and saw a young woman with dark hair stepping out of a modest sedan, carrying a small overnight bag and a bouquet of flowers for her mother. Even from a distance, the resemblance was unmistakable. This was his daughter, walking toward a meeting that would change both their lives forever. "No," Charles replied honestly, "but some things are too important to wait until you're ready." Eleanor's knock on the door came exactly at 4 o'clock, punctual in a way that reminded Charles of his own attention to timing and courtesy. Margaret opened the door with a smile that managed to hide her nervousness, embracing her daughter with the fierce love of a mother who knew their time together was limited. "Eleanor, darling, come meet my friend Charles. He knew your father years ago and wanted to meet you while he was visiting the area." Eleanor turned toward Charles with a warm smile and extended her hand in greeting. The moment their eyes met, Charles felt a jolt of recognition that went beyond physical resemblance. There was something in her expression, an intelligence and warmth that reminded him so strongly of his own mother that it took his breath away. "It's lovely to meet you, Charles," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the same musical quality that had drawn him to Margaret years before. "Mum has told me so little about my father's friends. I'm grateful for any stories you might be willing to share." As they shook hands, Charles felt the weight of generations of royal tradition pressing down on him, but also the simple, profound joy of a father meeting his daughter for the first time. Whatever complications lay ahead, this moment was perfect in its simplicity and truth. He was not a king meeting a subject, or a public figure managing a crisis. He was simply a father, finally meeting the daughter he had never known he had. The afternoon unfolded with an ease that surprised Charles. Eleanor proved to be exactly the kind of person Margaret had described: intelligent, compassionate, and refreshingly natural in her conversation. As they sat around Margaret's small dining table, sharing the traditional Scottish meal she had prepared, Charles found himself genuinely enjoying his daughter's company, not just as a father meeting his child, but as one adult appreciating another's perspective and warmth. Eleanor spoke passionately about her work at the Children's Hospital in Edinburgh, describing the challenges and rewards of caring for young patients facing serious illnesses. Her eyes lit up when she talked about the new therapeutic program she had helped develop, combining traditional medical care with art and music therapy to help children cope with their treatments. "The most important thing I've learned," Eleanor said, buttering a piece of fresh bread, "is that healing involves so much more than medicine. These children need to feel seen and valued as whole people, not just patients. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is simply your complete attention and genuine care." Charles found himself nodding, thinking about his own charitable work and the many hospitals he had visited over the years. "That's remarkably wise," he said. I imagine it takes special strength to work with children facing such difficult circumstances. It does, Eleanor admitted, but they teach me far more than I could ever teach them. Their courage and resilience in the face of uncertainty is extraordinary. They remind me every day that life's most precious gifts are often the simplest ones. A laugh shared with a friend, a beautiful sunset, the feeling of being truly known by someone who cares about you. Margaret watched the interaction between Charles and Eleanor with a mixture of joy and sadness. She could see the instant connection forming between father and daughter, the natural rapport that seemed to transcend their lack of shared history. At the same time, she knew that this peaceful moment was built on a foundation of incomplete truth, and that eventually, harder conversations would need to take place. After lunch, Eleanor suggested a walk through the gardens that surrounded the cottage. Margaret begged off, claiming fatigue, but Charles suspected she wanted to give him time alone with Eleanor. As they strolled among the autumn flowers, Eleanor pointed out various plants and shared stories about helping her mother maintain the gardens over the years. Mum has always been passionate about growing things, Eleanor said, kneeling to examine a late-blooming rosebush. She taught me that gardens require patience, consistency, and faith. You plant seeds not knowing exactly how they'll grow, but trusting that with proper care, something beautiful will emerge. Charles watched his daughter's gentle handling of the flowers, noting the same careful attention to detail that he brought to his own environmental work. Your mother sounds like a wise woman, he said. It's clear she raised you with strong values and a good understanding of what matters in life. Eleanor stood and brushed soil from her hands, looking directly at Charles with curiosity evident in her green eyes. May I ask how you knew my father? Mum has always been somewhat mysterious about that period in her life. I know they weren't married long before he died, and she rarely talks about him in specific detail. The question hung in the air between them, carrying weight that Eleanor couldn't possibly understand. Charles felt his heart rate increase as he considered his response. He had prepared for this moment, knowing that Eleanor's natural curiosity would eventually lead to such questions, but he found himself unprepared for the directness of her gaze and the trust implicit in her inquiry. Your father was someone I knew briefly, many years ago, Charles said carefully. We met during a time when I was exploring Scotland, learning about the landscape and the people who lived here. He was kind, intelligent, and deeply committed to making the world a better place. I think you would have been proud to know him. Eleanor nodded, seemingly satisfied with this general response. But Charles could see that she was processing his words carefully. There was an intelligence in her expression that reminded him of his own analytical nature, a quality that made him both proud and nervous about the conversation they were having. They continued their walk, the conversation turning to lighter topics. Eleanor shared stories about her university years, her decision to pursue nursing, and her love of photography. Charles found himself sharing more about his own interests than he had planned, talking about his environmental activism and his passion for sustainable agriculture. You know, Eleanor said as they approached a small wooden bench near a stream that ran behind the cottage, you remind me of someone, though I can't quite place who. There's something familiar about your manner of speaking, your gestures. Have we met before? The observation sent a chill through Charles. The resemblance that Margaret had noted in her letter was clearly visible to Eleanor as well, even if she couldn't yet place its significance. He realized that time was working against them. The longer he spent with Eleanor, the more likely it became that she would begin to piece together clues that would lead her to questions he wasn't ready to answer. Perhaps I have one of those faces, Charles said lightly, hoping to deflect her curiosity. People often tell me I remind them of someone they know. They sat on the bench, watching the gentle flow of the stream and listening to the wind through the trees. The late afternoon light filtered through the branches, creating patterns of shadow and sunshine that seemed to change with each passing cloud. In this peaceful moment, Charles felt the profound sadness of lost time, of 32 years during which he could have known Eleanor, could have been part of her childhood and young adulthood, could have shared in her triumphs and supported her through her challenges. Can I tell you something? Eleanor said suddenly, her voice taking on a more serious tone. I've always felt like there was a piece of my story missing. Mum is wonderful, and she's given me everything I could have asked for. But I've always sensed that there were things about my father, about my family history, that she wasn't telling me. Not because she wanted to hurt me, but because she was trying to protect me from something. Charles turned to look at his daughter, seeing in her expression the same searching quality he had often felt himself, the desire to understand one's place in the world and the forces that had shaped one's life. "What kind of things do you imagine she might be protecting you from?" he asked gently. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, clearly choosing her words carefully. "I don't know exactly. Sometimes I wonder if my father's family didn't approve of their relationship, or if there were circumstances around his death that were particularly painful. Mum gets this distant look in her eyes whenever I ask too many specific questions. It's not that she won't answer, it's that the answers seem to cause her pain." The insight showed Eleanor's maturity and emotional intelligence, qualities that made Charles even more proud of the woman she had become. At the same time, her words highlighted the impossible position Margaret had been in for over 3 decades, carrying the weight of this secret while trying to give her daughter a stable, honest life. "Your mother loves you very much," Charles said finally. "Sometimes people keep secrets not because they don't trust us, but because they're trying to spare us from burdens that might be too heavy to carry." "I understand that," Eleanor replied. "But I'm not a child anymore. If there's something difficult about my father or my family history, I think I'm strong enough to handle the truth. In fact, not knowing has sometimes been harder than knowing might be." Her words struck Charles with unexpected force. Here was his daughter, essentially asking for the very truth he was struggling to decide whether to give her. She was telling him, without knowing who he was, that she was ready to learn whatever secrets had been kept from her, that she would prefer difficult truth to protective ignorance. As they walked back toward the cottage, Charles found himself making a decision that surprised him. He would tell Eleanor the truth, but not tonight, and not without careful preparation. She deserved to know who her father was, and she deserved to hear it from him directly, rather than discovering it through the media speculation that was almost certainly coming. But first, he needed to make arrangements to protect her from the storm that revelation would bring. If Eleanor was going to learn that she was the daughter of the King of England, she would need support, guidance, and time to process what that meant for her life and her future. She would need legal protection, media training, and most importantly, she would need to understand that being royal was not just about privilege, but about service and sacrifice. When they returned to the cottage, Margaret was waiting with tea and an expression that suggested she knew something significant had transpired during their walk. Charles caught her eye and nodded slightly, a signal that conveyed his decision without alerting Eleanor to the undercurrents of their communication. The evening passed quietly with conversation about books, travel, and Eleanor's plans for the following year. As the night grew late, Eleanor prepared to return to her hotel in the village, but not before embracing both Margaret and Charles with the natural warmth that characterized all her interactions. "Thank you for sharing your stories about my father," she said to Charles as they stood at the cottage door. "It means more than you know to hear about him from someone who actually knew him. I hope we'll have the chance to talk again soon." Charles watched his daughter drive away into the Scottish night, her taillights disappearing around a bend in the road. Tomorrow, he would return to London and begin the complex process of preparing for a revelation that would change not just his life and Eleanor's, but the very nature of the modern monarchy. Tonight, however, he would cherish the memory of an afternoon spent with his daughter, getting to know her as the remarkable woman she had become, and beginning to understand the magnitude of what he had missed and what he hoped to build in the time they had ahead. 2 weeks after returning from Scotland, King Charles III sat in the same private study where he had first read Margaret's letter, but this time he was not alone. Across from him sat Sir Thomas Whitmore, his longest-serving advisor and one of the few people who knew the full scope of the situation that was about to unfold. Between them lay documents that would change the course of royal history, DNA test results, legal opinions, and a carefully crafted statement that would introduce Eleanor Sinclair to the world as the king's daughter. The DNA confirmation had arrived that morning, though Charles had known in his heart from the moment he met Eleanor that scientific proof would only validate what was already obvious. Eleanor was his daughter, and now the question was no longer whether to reveal this truth, but how to do so in a way that protected her while honoring the monarchy's commitment to transparency and service. "The media speculation is intensifying, Your Majesty," Sir Thomas reported, adjusting his reading glasses as he reviewed the latest intelligence reports. "It's about history. A special image is represented between the 2 pages of the waters, so they can be assisted by thermostans or central local community. 3 different newspapers have been replaced under ceremonial. And because of the 2 pages of the table of cases, Charles nodded grimly. The inevitable had arrived sooner than he had hoped, but he had used the past 2 weeks well. Eleanor had been approached carefully through Margaret, prepared gradually for the revelation of her true parentage, and provided with a comprehensive support system, including legal counsel, security arrangements, and psychological counseling to help her navigate the dramatic change her life was about to undergo. The conversation with Eleanor had taken place just 3 days ago, in Margaret's cottage with only the 3 of them present. Charles would never forget the moment when Margaret finally spoke the words that ended 32 years of secrecy. "Eleanor, darling, Charles is not just a friend from my past. He's your father." The silence that followed had seemed to last forever, though it was probably only seconds before Eleanor looked from her mother to Charles and back again, her analytical mind processing this information with the same careful attention she brought to everything in her life. "My father," she had said quietly, not as a question, but as a statement she was testing against everything she had always wondered about herself. "The man who died when I was a baby was not my father." "No, sweetheart. I created that story to protect both you and Charles from complications that seemed insurmountable at the time. Charles is your biological father, and he had no knowledge of your existence until I wrote to him 2 weeks ago." Eleanor had turned to study Charles with new eyes, suddenly seeing in his features the explanation for her own appearance, her own mannerisms, her own inexplicable interests and talents. The resemblance that had nagged at her during their first meeting now made perfect sense. "You're King Charles," she had said, the full implication of Margaret's revelation hitting her with startling clarity. "You're the King of England, and that makes me—" "It makes you my daughter," Charles had replied simply. "Everything else we can figure out together." The conversation that followed had been one of the most important of Charles's life. Eleanor had asked direct questions about why he hadn't been part of her life, whether he would have wanted to know her if he had been aware of her existence, and what this revelation meant for her future. Charles had answered with complete honesty, acknowledging his own failings and uncertainties, while expressing his deep regret for the lost years and his commitment to building a relationship with her now. Eleanor's response had been everything Charles could have hoped for and more. She was angry about the deception, but she understood the impossible position Margaret had been in. She was overwhelmed by the implications of royal parentage, but she was also curious about the opportunities it might provide to serve others. Most importantly, she wanted to get to know her father as a person, not just as a king. Now, sitting in his study with Sir Thomas, Charles was finalizing plans for Eleanor's introduction to royal life and public service. The decision they had reached together was unprecedented. Eleanor would be acknowledged as the king's daughter and granted her rightful place in the line of succession, but she would also be given the option to step away from royal duties if she chose to maintain her private life. "The legal precedent is complex but not insurmountable," Sir Thomas explained, reviewing documents prepared by the Crown's attorneys. "Parliament will need to address questions about succession rights for children born outside marriage, but the general principle has historical support. More challenging will be public opinion and media management." Charles had anticipated this challenge and had spent considerable time developing a strategy that emphasized Eleanor's character, her service to others through her nursing career, and her commitment to the values that the monarchy represented, rather than trying to hide or minimize her unconventional path to royal recognition. They would present it as an example of the monarchy's evolution and its commitment to recognizing merit and service over mere circumstance of birth. "What about Eleanor herself?" Sir Thomas asked. "How is she handling the preparation for public life?" The question brought a smile to Charles's face. Over the past 2 weeks, he had spent several hours with Eleanor, both at Buckingham Palace and at his private residences, watching her navigate the complexities of royal protocol with the same grace and intelligence she brought to everything else. She had met with constitutional experts, media advisors, and senior royal staff, asking thoughtful questions and offering insights that impressed everyone who worked with her. "She's remarkable," Charles replied. "She has a natural understanding of service and duty that can't be taught. Yesterday, she spent 3 hours at the children's hospital where she works, not because it was required, but because she wanted to ensure her patients were properly cared for during her upcoming absence." Her colleagues describe her as irreplaceable. The irony was not lost on Charles that Eleanor's dedication to serving others, particularly children facing medical challenges, was exactly the kind of work that exemplified the best traditions of royal duty. She had been living a life of service without knowing she was royal, guided by values that perfectly aligned with what the monarchy hoped to represent in the modern world. A knock on the study door interrupted their conversation. Eleanor entered, accompanied by a lady-in-waiting who had been assigned to help her navigate royal protocols. Even after 2 weeks of preparation, Charles still felt a moment of wonder at seeing his daughter in this context. Knowing that this remarkable woman was his child, and that they were about to embark on a journey together that would redefine both their lives. "Father," Eleanor said, the word still new enough that both of them felt its weight. "Are you ready for tomorrow's announcement?" Tomorrow would mark the official revelation of Eleanor's parentage, followed by her first public appearance as a member of the royal family. The event had been carefully planned as a visit to the children's hospital where Eleanor worked, allowing the public to see her in the environment where she had already proven her dedication to service. "I am if you are," Charles replied, "but I want you to know that if you change your mind, if this feels like too much, we can find another way forward. Your well-being is more important than any royal protocol or public expectation." Eleanor moved to the window overlooking the palace gardens, the same view that Charles had contemplated during so many difficult decisions over the years. "I've been thinking about what you told me about duty and service," she said. "How the crown isn't really about privilege, but about using whatever platform you have to help others and serve something larger than yourself." Charles nodded, remembering their conversation about the responsibilities that came with royal status. "I've been doing that work my entire adult life," Eleanor continued. "I've just been doing it without recognition or resources. Now I have the opportunity to do it on a larger scale, to use the platform that comes with being your daughter to advocate for causes I care about, particularly children's healthcare and medical research." She turned from the window to face both men, her expression conveying both determination and vulnerable. "I'm scared about losing my privacy and having my every move scrutinized by the media. I'm worried about making mistakes or saying the wrong thing. But I'm also excited about the possibility of making a real difference, of using this unexpected opportunity to serve others." Sir Thomas smiled, clearly impressed by Eleanor's maturity and perspective. "Your Majesty, if I may say so, I think the monarchy is about to be strengthened immeasurably by Eleanor's presence. Her combination of real-world experience and natural grace is exactly what we need for the challenges ahead." The next morning dawned clear and bright, perfect weather for what Charles privately thought of as Eleanor's debut as his daughter and as a working member of the royal family. The announcement had been released just after sunrise, carefully worded to acknowledge the unusual circumstances while emphasizing Eleanor's character and qualifications for royal duty. As their convoy approached the children's hospital, Charles could see crowds of people lining the streets, many holding signs welcoming Eleanor to the royal family. The public reaction had been overwhelmingly positive, with media commentary focusing on the king's honesty in acknowledging his daughter and Eleanor's impressive record of service to others. "They seem genuinely happy about this," Eleanor observed, looking out at the smiling faces in the crowd. "I was expecting more skepticism or criticism." "I think people respect authenticity," Charles replied. "You've lived a life of genuine service, and that means more to most people than the circumstances of your birth or the timing of this revelation." Their first stop was the pediatric ward where Eleanor had worked for the past 5 years. Her colleagues had gathered to meet the king, but more importantly, to show their support for Eleanor as she transitioned into her new role. Charles watched with pride as Eleanor moved naturally among the patients and staff, introducing him to children she had cared for and explaining the various programs she had helped develop. One moment particularly touched Charles's heart. Eleanor sat beside a young patient who was scheduled for surgery later that week, holding the child's hand and explaining in simple terms what would happen and how the medical team would take good care of her. The little girl's mother watched with tears in her eyes, clearly moved by Eleanor's compassion and professionalism. "That's Princess Eleanor," the child whispered to her mother, using the title that had been part of the morning's announcement. "But she's still my nurse." As they prepared to leave the hospital for their next engagement, Charles reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The decision to acknowledge Eleanor had been painful in its complexity, requiring him to balance personal happiness against royal duty, family loyalty against institutional stability. But watching her in action, seeing the natural way she connected with people, and her genuine commitment to serving others, Charles knew he had made the right choice. The monarchy had survived and thrived for over 1,000 years by adapting to changing times while maintaining its core commitment to service. Eleanor represented that evolution perfectly. A royal who had earned her place through merit and character rather than accident of birth. Someone who understood both the privileges and responsibilities of her position because she had lived a life dedicated to helping others long before she knew she was royal. As their convoy pulled away from the hospital, Eleanor reached for Charles's hand, squeezing it gently in a gesture of gratitude and affection that spoke volumes about the relationship they were building together. "Thank you," she said simply, "for finding the courage to tell me the truth and for giving me the chance to be part of something bigger than myself." Charles squeezed her hand in return, feeling for the first time in weeks that his decision had been not just right, but transformative for both of them and for the monarchy itself. Sometimes, he reflected, the most difficult decisions led to the most unexpected and wonderful outcomes. His daughter was proof of that truth, and their future together was full of possibilities he could never have imagined when he first read Margaret's letter just a month ago.